Our two speakers today are protagonists in promoting, designing, and implementing sustainable places. Today, they will tell us about their experience of doing so at Fawley, a disused power station site on Southampton Water. It has been a very long journey for them, and their experiences there are fascinating. And at the same time, they will no doubt give us a lot of insight into creating a new town. Our first speaker is Aldred Drummond, who is the founder of Fawley Waterside Limited. He's a director of real estate at Long Harbour, and he has overseen investments in 23 towns and cities in the UK. He is also the owner of the neighbouring Catlan estate and a prominent figure in all things to do with South Hampshire. With that introduction, I hand over to Aldred for his presentation.
Good afternoon, all, and thank you for inviting me on this lunch hour meeting. If we switch to the next slide. Here you can see the power station just before we started demolition in all its glory. It was the largest oil-fired power station in the world when it was built, at the princely sum of £100 million. It was by some distance the most expensive power station designed at the time in the 1960s to support the white heat of British industry. And there were 9 other power stations built at the same time, all of them coal, and 1 oil-fired power station. And it was designed as a great showcase, and therefore the building itself, which we will come on to see, had some quite innovative design and was in its way rather beautiful. But enormous. It is 400 meters long, 100 meters wide, and about 70 meters high without the chimney stack, and sits within the New Forest National Park and adjacent to the Southampton waters. So you can imagine bringing this forward for a new town, despite having, my wife's dog barking in the background. Despite having some extremely useful infrastructure, which I will come on to, it has certainly been a challenging project. If you flick on to the next slide. This was the administration building being built. It has a slight hint of Star Wars and Mission Impossible 2, Mission Impossible 5, all of which have been filmed here. And in itself is a rather spectacular building. Unfortunately, it has to come down as it's riddled with asbestos and almost impossible to convert into another use, but in itself rather spectacular. Next slide, please. Here you can see them building the dock in the 1960s, and that is a really significantly useful bit of infrastructure, and that goes into the basement area, which is the largest unsupported basement in Europe, and for an urban designer, developer, an incredibly useful bit of infrastructure that we could, if we so wished, park about 4,000 cars within, so that when you come on to see the master plan, it's probably the first town that's been developed really without particular regard to surface level car parking, because we can put everything, as I said, within an underground space, leaving the streets very much freed for pedestrians and bicyclists as opposed to the motor car. Next slide, please. That's within the turbine hall, the great cathedral of power. That building was 100 feet high, and those in front of you are the Parsons turbines, each of them 500 megawatts, and 4 of them totaling 2,000 megawatts of power. Next slide, please. That's the administration building some years ago. Next slide, please. And this is post-demolition. So, well, during demolition, it's pretty much what it looks like now. We started the demolition process in 2016, and that was an explosive event which brought down the turbine hall and the deaerator building, which was in its way a rather spectacular 400-meter long glass facade. Everything went according to plan. And in the foreground and the background, you can see wind turbines. So we have a meanwhile use on the site, rather appropriate for a power station. Those are MHI Vestas's wind turbine blades, capable of about 10 megawatts of production per turbine. And once they're standing, they're about the same height as the 200-meter chimney that you can see in front of you. Next slide, please. This was the first sketch that we did. Really was a sketch of the potential new town, and the idea was based on the sort of great ports, and particularly the great naval ports of this country. And we looked at Chatham, we looked at Portsmouth, and we had an idea of utilising the basement structure and creating these great sort of pools for boats, around which we were going to develop a very sort of marina-like project. One thing, it was just far too expensive to do all of that digging into the ground, and also the development area was significantly reduced. So this plan, which was just a sketch to kind of make some suggestions, was fairly swiftly abandoned. Next slide, please. That's the master plan, as you imagine. And the big long basin to the left is where the existing basement is. So we were creating an additional 2 basements and then a sort of canalized landscape beyond. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And that was an idea for sort of houses along the canals. Next slide, please. And during this journey, and I think this is one of the challenges that we've had, is we have really looked at all sorts of different options. This was a sketch by Wilkinson Eyre, famous for many things, but in particular for looking at the or doing the design and architecture for Battersea Power Station. And we had them appraise the site and see whether we could retain some of the existing power station structures. And it was, you know, without the house prices, let's say in Battersea, it was just prohibitive. There was just no way we could develop it. And actually, I think what we have now is a much finer scheme, though this in its own way had great merit. Next slide, please. And that was Marks Barfield design for Marks Barfield being very famous for the London Eye and for I-360. And we were looking at repurposing the chimney to create a sort of place in the sky with great views and various other sort of entertainments and restaurants on top of it. Unfortunately, that got clobbered by the desire, and I think quite rightly, for the National Park and Natural England to see the removal of all of the large industrial structures if they were to support this application. So that was consigned to the waste bin, unfortunately. Next slide, please. And we can see from that previous slide the rather spectacular glass facade. And then we start to move into the appointment of Leon Creer as the master planner. And this is one of Leon's original sketches. And as you can see, he's had a different view from Marks Barfield for the chimney. This is a rostral column. And for those who've been to St. Petersburg, you can see them outside the Admiralty. They were created by the Romans to celebrate great victories at sea. And Leon, a rather playful sketch of him designing something. But you can see the master plan is really beginning to turn into a town as opposed to a development around the power station. Next slide, please. And this is one of the things I think is extremely pertinent. And this sketch has always struck me. This was, again, an early sketch by Leon of what he calls the walk time, and the idea that this town should be predominantly about pedestrians, and that services ought to be walkable within a short period of time, so that everything was accessible on foot. And this is extremely topical at the moment. There was a long article in the Financial Times over the weekend about 15-minute cities. So this is maybe something people will want to pick up on. Next slide, please. Here again, the same thing. And this is the idea of creating sort of service centres within, or a town of polycentres around a sort of main centre. And our main centre is the port infrastructure of the power station. Next slide, please. More sketches of Leon in his architectural fashion. We've taken some of these on board and sort of changed them a little bit, but the hotel is very much where it was. And I think the master plan is very, very true to Leon's master plan, though some of the designs have changed over the subsequent 3 or 4 years. Next slide, please. This is a sketch plan of the site. Here, the chimney is still there of the town looking south. Next slide, please. And this is looking back towards, that's large building in the foreground is actually an automated boat stack, which can accommodate about 600 vessels, 600 boats up to about 15 meters in height. And there on the right, you can see a repurposed glass structure from the original power station. Unfortunately, that just proved impossible to do. So you can see that we've tried many, many different things as we've come up with this master plan. Next slide, please. Again, looking north along the facade, the esplanade, looking still with the chimney in place. Next slide, please. And into the southern village. Part of the development is within the national park, and where we are within the national park, the strong advice was to keep it very much looking of the national park. So this is effectively our suburb to our urb, and these are all houses. Next slide, please. And I think, you know, one of the challenges, and I've been in this business for 20 years, and I have never spent so much time and so many hours. I mean, have been tens of thousands of hours looking at this project, and we have gone through numerous master plan changes, trying to fit in the various different uses into the town. And the whole philosophy has been one of economic prosperity, mixed use and economic prosperity. The town must have a purpose if it is not just to be you know, a sort of dormitory town to Southampton. We have really focused on what its key economic themes are, and I can unpack those later if people so wish. Next slide, please. And as in the introduction, Andreas said, this is the estate to which I own, which surrounds the power station. The power station was built on land that formerly belonged to the estate, and it's been absolutely critical to make sure that the town fits very much into its landscape and doesn't dominate it too much. And there is a hugely symbiotic relationship that can be built between the farm effectively becoming the provider of food, good, local, high quality food to the town, as opposed to merely exporting to the global commodity markets, which we do at the moment. Next slide, please. And that's one of the original aerial sketches, still with the repurposed chimney. And you can see the difference in uses. You've got the northern industrial quarter, commercial quarter, and you've got what we call the heart of town around the canal and the dock. And you can see the large boat stack in the foreground. And then you've got the suburb or the southern village to the south. And the whole thing blends rather neatly into its landscape. Next slide, please. This is a very recent master plan, and it also shows some of the uses. One of our focuses for employment is on maritime. 20% of the gross value add of the Solent area is focused on maritime. So it's been a very strong theme for us to try and get a maritime centre of excellence into the town when we have access onto the Southampton water, which is Britain's busiest sea lane, and our largest export port is the Port of Southampton. Next slide, please. That's just a close-up. Next slide, please. And these are some of the sketches going down the main access road with the buildings on the right. And the replacement chimney building is 100 meters high and is a very deliberate landmark building. There were strong representations from the marine community and from the local community that they wanted to see a landmark building replace the power station chimney if that had to go. 70% of the locals wanted it to be retained. So we've come up with our own version of it. Looks a bit like the Admiralty Spire in St. Petersburg, if people are familiar with that. Next slide, please. This is down around the dock, looking out. That's a hotel on the left. Take inspiration from the extremely high quality Art Deco civic buildings in Southampton. And this is meant to evoke the sort of feeling of a maritime community. Slightly Bucklers Hard meets port side life. The sort of Docklands buildings of London, but all at a fairly domestic scale, everything really between 3 to 5 stories. Next slide, please. And this is going back up into the heart of town, and again, trying to keep everything at a reasonably domestic scale. Next slide, please. And now this is unique in that we're in the Southern Village, we're in the New Forest, and these are animals that have come off the forest that can graze within the Southern Village as they can in the villages of Bewley or Brockenhurst. Next slide, please. And again, the new aerial view showing the sort of iteration, the further iteration of the one before. Next slide, please. So there ends my slides. But just to sort of, I suppose, to kind of recap on the main challenges, which have been the focus. One of the big challenges is that you're building a new place. You're not tacking on new buildings to an existing place. So you have to really start from scratch. You also have to have the confidence that you're going to build it big enough and fast enough to get enough vitality and vibrancy into the place so that it doesn't feel like it's sort of come from Mars. And that is one of the things that we are really working through. And the critical to that is getting the employment story right. So I think probably our biggest challenge is really ensuring that we've got long-term economic prosperity for the town. And we pick themes that are already important and strong within our local economy. We're lucky in the Southampton area that there are, business is very productive and very strong. So that has been a big challenge. Also reutilising the infrastructure of the power station, whilst a great boon in many ways, having the largest unsupported basement in Europe, it does pose challenges and expenses trying to reuse it. And then we sit within the New Forest National Park. So the environmental challenges and the hurdles that we've had to overcome, quite rightly, from Natural England, from the National Park Authority, etc., have been very stringent, and quite correctly so. But that has been a significant challenge that is not normally found with most developments. And then again, we've got the maritime environmental protections, which are, if possible, even tighter than terrestrial protections. So the Southampton water absorbs about 11 or 12% of the UK's overwintering wildfowl. And that they must be protected in themselves. So yes, there has, and traffic, which I'm not going to steal Athol's thunder, but we are at the end of one long single road. So public transport, road improvements have been as they are with any project, a challenge. But all in all, it's been a fascinating journey. I think we've all thoroughly enjoyed it. It's had its challenges, but they've all been overcome with good humour and intelligence so far. And I think we are on our way to achieving our ambition, which is to build one of the most beautiful small towns in England.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Aldred. What a fantastic project. I hope you can all see from this small introduction how much passion there is on behalf of the promoter to create a fantastic place, regenerative place for that peninsula. And as Aldred said, one of the key considerations for the project has been its connectivity and transport, which is how now we are going to move on to the next speaker, who is Atholl Noon. I think I am going to say, without blushing, the best transport planner I have ever worked with. Atholl used to be a director at Colin Buchanan and Partners, and he is one of the founding directors of Markides Associates. He has worked on many projects for both developers and local authorities. He's worked in Oxford City, Durham, Edinburgh, and he has also given evidence at many inquiries, most recently at the Silvertown Tunnel inquiry on behalf of TfL. So without further ado, I give you Atholl Noon.
Thanks, Andreas. I'll just share my my screen if I can. Oops, sorry. Sorry, just trying to share my screen at the moment.
Please let me know if you'd like me to share on your behalf.
Yeah, maybe that'll be better, Stephen. I've done for some reason it seems not to be showing the PowerPoint. I think you've got a copy of it, haven't you? So
yeah.
Be great. Thanks. Thank you. That's great. Thanks. So just go to the next slide, Stephen. So really, thank you, Andreas, and thank you, Aldred, for that the great summary of the project. I think you probably could have spent a whole day on the project without even touching sides on the things that have grown on the project. But essentially, I'm just going to run through very quickly about the transport strategy for the site and how we've developed both on-site and off-site transport facilities, really. And so I suppose the starting point is the strategy is that as Aldred pointed out, that everything's centered around the dock, which will be about 10 minutes maximum walking distance from the rest of the development. And all homes will be within 5-minute walks of bus stops and a short walk of a potential new primary school. And so building around that, all the existing footpaths and cycle paths will remain. There's a few public rights of way which are quite popular along the shoreline, but they're going to be enhanced and extended, and I'll explain some of those just now. And obviously we've been talking to the local bus operator about extending the services, which I'll discuss. Aldred mentioned targeted highway improvements, and we've also been looking at ways in which the site could be served by a foot ferry and railway, which I'll discuss very briefly. Can you just show the next slide, please? So really for us, the key themes on transport are really that the foundation's accessibility is a walkable, compact site with mixed uses. And everyday services are provided within the development. And it's amazing to think how many local services will be within walking distance or easy cycling distance of the development. As Aldred pointed out, by the use of underground parking, it means we can keep the streets largely traffic free, so creating an attractive and safe environment for pedestrians and cyclists. And we can obviously encourage these local connections to the neighbouring villages and communities by walking, cycling and bus, and the potential for ferry and rail for longer journeys. One interesting thing that's really come out in the last 6 months has been the effect of COVID-19, and in a way, the push for increased home working and a greater emphasis on a work-life balance, and having the technology to enable you to work at least part-time from home, if not full-time from home, has really meant that locations such as Fawley I think have come more prominent in a way. In fact, it's almost an ideal location for a post-COVID lifestyle. If you wish to only commute 1 or 2 days a week, and you wish to work from home a lot and have a fantastic living environment with most facilities local, it really does offer that potential. Just the next slide, please. So I won't go on. This is talking about Leon Creer's original master plan with his walkable cities approach, and really, as Aldred points out, that's been taken up a lot in other areas. I think Paris is looking at the 15-minute city, so is London in many ways. So the next slide. And arising out of the original Leon Creer master plan was a basic principle of a road running down the western side of the development, which was sort of like a spine road connecting the neighbouring village of Calshot to the site in the wider network, and a whole series of secondary and tertiary streets running off into the development itself, but also maximising the developable area that you have there. And as you've pointed out, most of those streets will be generally very, very low car use. And the next slide will show you a bit about that. So this next slide shows that in the brown, the first brown area is actually an area of a massive basement. I think, if my memory serves me correctly, it's approximately 300 meters long by 100 meters wide and 4 or 5 stories deep. And the idea was to use that as a shared use car park, as shown below. You know, there's a sketch shown below, to take away a lot of the cars from the streets themselves. There's also a little bit more of basement parking on the other brown areas shown to cover those locations as well. But what that really means is that the parking's using the infrastructure that's there already, so it should be cheaper and easier to do that. It also is more efficient to share parking. You know, in other words, the different users can share that parking, and makes the provision of things like electric car points much easier and better. So it's quite a unique nature of the site, but you know, and actually it helps to make the service environment very, very much better. So the next slide, please. And this shows, I think it's the same slide Aldred showed, one of the typical streets in the centre of town, in the centre of the town, showing the kind of densities involved and the type of streets that will be available. But really, those streets will be the domain of the pedestrian and cyclist rather than the car. You know, the only cars allowed in there will be for specific purposes, such as disabled or specifically to use to go to a premise for a particular purpose. And the next slide. The next slide showed another variation. Aldred mentioned that on the southern quarter, it's much more a lower density national park kind of environment. And there it shows that the road system there will be much more informal, more rural. And in fact, those actual roads shown are made of hoggen to fit in with the landscape that will be created. And on the next slide, it just shows a very small section of the main road running down the western side of the development. Now this road will change in its nature as it goes through the area. And on the entry and exit to the main part of the site, it's much more rural and national park in character. It won't have any curbs. The landscaping will be much wilder, and that's the nature of it. And then as it gets into the urban heart of the town, then it becomes a bit more of an urban boulevard. The landscape architects, Kim Wilkie and Fabric, have developed this concept of these lines of oak trees on mounds down the road. And we've got a shared use walk cycle path above it, and quite a narrow road with narrowings where there's pedestrian crossings to enable people to access the surrounding natural areas, of which there's an extensive area there. Next slide. So that was a brief summary of the kind of the transport and access on the site. This slide shows the network of walk and cycle routes around the site itself. That's the core sort of heart of town. This is the southern quarter. And there's an existing public rights of way which goes partially along the foreshore, and that's going to be extended to a fantastic facility at Calshot. There's a massive Calshot facility centre run by Hampshire County Council on the Calshot Spit. There's a beach there, and the neighbouring village of Calshot, and it shows how the pathways will link you into the surrounding natural areas, which are being opened up by Aldred to encourage more local use of the area, rather than people driving off into the national park further afield. Next slide. So one of the core transport improvements we are proposing in the development is a new segregated shared use walk cycle facility, which is about 4.5 kilometers long, which runs from effectively the Calshot Spit and the beach and the village of Calshot right through the site onto the neighbouring village of Fawley, where there's schools and shops and facilities, on past a recreational ground run by the local parish council, and onto the next settlement of Holbury, where there's also a secondary school. And we think that's a really fantastic facility that'll connect the site to the neighbouring settlements and to the schools. With the advent of e-bikes, we think there's going to be a tremendous potential to start using these new safer routes to connect the wider communities. This route actually ties in with a new route proposed by Hampshire County Council all the way from Holbury right the way through the neighbouring communities of Marshwood and Hythe onto Totton and actually onto Southampton itself. So there'll be a new safe and segregated cycle route all the way from Southampton, effectively all the way down to Calshot and to Fawley Waterside. The next slide. So I mentioned buses very briefly. It's a pretty good location to extend bus routes because there are already 2 services that terminate in the area. And obviously we'll be creating a big new passenger focus at the end of a set of bus routes, which always helps to balance the flows of the bus routes and also make sure that they'll be commercially viable in the future. So we've been working with the local operator Blue Star, who's very proactive to work out the best way to serve the sites. And as we said before, all the development will be 5 minutes walk of 3 sets of bus stops. There's future potential to adapt the bus services, perhaps to introduce some more express services to reduce the journey times to Southampton, and also to perhaps do some demand responsive services to local areas. The bus services at the moment go all the way to Southampton, but they're a little bit slow because they go through all the neighbouring communities. Next slide, please. Another strategic transport infrastructure that we've been proposing and facilitating over the last couple of years, one that's actually Aldred has a very big personal interest in, is the reopening of the Fawley branch line. Now, this is an existing freight line that runs from Southampton Central to the refinery just past Hythe. The line is there, it's being used very sporadically for freight. It has a couple of stations, it has some signalling, and we think there's a great potential in reopening that for passenger use. And what we've shown on this match is a first phase which takes the line from Southampton Central through Totton, Marchwood and Hythe onto a parkway station, which is a short distance from Fawley Waterside. There's another possible phase that takes it all the way to the site, but that's a whole new cost. So it's perhaps best to get this first stage in before we go to the next stage. We think a half-hourly rail service would be very competitive with the car. It should be relatively low cost to implement because of the existing infrastructure. And there's actually more potential to actually link the site with cross services across the Southampton metro area, which is quite exciting. And so working with Hampshire County Council and the Three Rivers Community Rail Partnership, which has been very proactive as well, and the Department for Transport, we've secured some seed funding as one of the top priorities for reopening railway lines. But of course, railways are a slow process, and I think we're on a really good pathway to reopening that, but it does take some time. And the next slide, please. The other thing we've been looking at and done a preliminary business case for is a ferry service. So the site has a dock on the Southampton Water. It's probably a 25-minute journey time by ferry to Southampton Town Quay, where there's lots of other facilities and stations not far away. We've done a business case which estimates the patronage and so on, and we think there's a pathway to achieving that, starting off with smaller foot ferries and gradually increasing those as demand increases. It does need additional subsidy. There are opportunities to also stop at other locations along Southampton Water, and we know the local stakeholders such as Southampton City Council and the local enterprise partnership are keen on that. And obviously there's tourism potential from this kind of thing. It actually links up to the cruise ships terminal in Southampton Water. So this and the rail service aren't part of our current planning application, but they're things that we're very keen on and are pushing hard that over the coming years they actually come to fruition. In addition to these aspects I've discussed, there's obviously the highways elements, as Aldred pointed out. And of course, even though there are a lot of sustainable transport opportunities, there will still be traffic, there will still be vehicles and cars. And our strategy there has been to try and reduce that as much as possible through the mechanisms we've talked about, and also to introduce car sharing, to make sure those cars used have a very high potential to use electric vehicles, and to do freight consolidation of goods and services to the development. But we have agreed a set of, but there's obviously local community concern about additional traffic and intensification. We've agreed a package of highway improvement works on the local corridor with the county council, and are looking to implement that over the coming years as well.
2 minutes, Atholl, 2 minutes.
Okay, my next slide. Sorry, last slide. So this is the control room where we will be controlling all of Fawley's transport needs. So there'll be people sitting in this control room that tell people exactly how and when to travel to make it more sustainable and accessible. Now, I'm afraid that's a bit of a joke. That's the existing control room of the power station. It's where they would manage the power supply to the network of the old power station. We won't have a control room like that. We think technology will play a big part in the future of the site, not least with 5G connections enabling people to work on the site, but also in providing information and new transport modes to people as we go on. So I'm afraid it won't be quite like a James Bond control room as that, but certainly I think that everything else we've put in place will make for a successful development down here. I think that's all, Andreas.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Atholl. Thank you, Aldred, as well. We now come to the questions. There are lots of them. I'm going to start with one that has been asked by several people, including Catherine Firth, and that's about the housing tenures and the kind of housing mix that is anticipated on the site. Aldred, I think that's probably one for you.
Sure. The housing tenure, so there's 35% affordable housing and 65% private. Of the 65% private, we think about 10% will be private rented. So it'll be roughly 50-50 overall. And then there's a huge range of housing within that, from small flats right through to some pretty substantial houses. So it's got an enormous variety.
Thank you. Staying with the land uses, Victor Nichols asked a question about will there be any education provision and how will energy be generated?
There's a primary school proposed, but we're close to a good secondary school, which Atholl had on his plan, which we're having a dedicated cycle route straight through to it, that has plenty of capacity to expand and should get to excellent status in the next year or two. So we don't need to provide a new secondary school, but there will be a new primary school. And the second question was on energy. It'll all be electric energy. One of the things that is innovative and different is that we're working with the refinery, which is a couple of miles to the north, to see whether we can bring in some of their waste heat into a district heating system that may serve both the employment area and also to as a district heating system for part of the town. And we're working with the government's HNIP project to see whether that can be part funded by the government, because it's not an easy thing to make work without some assistance.
Okay, thank you. Can I bring in Claire San Martin, please, who had two questions, one on local governance, the other one about well, I'll let Claire ask her two questions.
Hi. Well, in terms of the holiday village question, it's just such an amazing location and close to the Solent. I wondered, are there any special measures to make sure it doesn't become a sort of second homeowners village? And also, how is the governance supposed to work? Is there going to be a special sort of governance specifically for this place, or is it just linked into the general system of parish councils, etc.?
So the answer to the first question is that, as I said in my opening words, was trying to ensure that the place has economic sustainability. We've got about a third of the town is for commercial uses, so there's about 2,500 jobs, and there will be somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 homes. So the idea is very much to build upon what is already very successful in the local area in terms of employment. So there's a wide range of high technology businesses, precision engineering businesses, and businesses connected with maritime. So that's our main focus, and we believe that providing those jobs will encourage people to live and work there. But there's no special measures to prevent people buying homes. And then the second question, the governance. Well, there will be, in the normal way, local government plus a management company, which the residents will participate in. I think it's critical to keep the elements of the project maintained under a single governance structure, to keep the quality, to keep maintenance of some of the non-adopted areas. As you saw from some of the slides, quite a lot of the streets are not adopted. So there will be a service charge both for the commercial property and the residential property to keep those maintained.
Thank you, Aldred. David Rudland had a question about the planning status. David, can I ask you to come in and ask? You had a number of different points regarding the planning status of the project.
Yeah, I just think I had a meeting this morning about a planning application we're doing for new settlements on a industrial, derelict industrial site on the edge of the Peak District. And I was just thinking that was really hard work, and this must have been a very difficult sell to look at something which is relatively isolated. I know you say it's quite close to things, but it actually is quite isolated. End of a cul-de-sac in a national park, within a national park, and ecologically sensitive area. I mean, how did you get that through the planning system?
Well, it's 150 acres of brownfield land to start with.
So ours as well.
So and with a great deal of infrastructure within it, because of its legacy as being formerly a power station. So sort of electricity supply, water supply. We actually had our own sewage treatment works, etc. is already there. But no, it's been a challenge. I mean, that we've worked very closely with the statutory agencies because we are within a national park. But because of the whole site is about 400 acres, so there's 150 acres of brown, if you like, and 250 acres of greens. So we are able to do a great deal for biodiversity. I think we've got a 35% gain on biodiversity within the red line from what it is existing. And then there's the wider nature park, which is expanding the footpaths and droveways into the estate itself, and opening up some of those areas to public access. So there's been a very, very strong drive to improve biodiversity and resilience in the future. But it's been, it's taken us 5 years. I mean, in terms of a large project, that's not that unusual. Mm-hmm. But I think as Atholl touched on, in some ways, this working from home concept is pushing in our direction. I have a number of tenants and big gaming companies actually already down there who are in some of our buildings, and they have found for many years that they've liked it being in places where their employees feel a sense of wellness and sort of vivacity that is quite outside where they are at work. They like being in one of them's in a converted farmstead in the middle of the forest. They've got 80 people working there with a large fibre pipe, and they're connected all over the world. And so this sort of drive for wellness, the sort of war for talent, and making it more of a kind of a place where people want to be and want to work, and then providing enough services locally so that you don't need to just hop in your car to go and buy your day-to-day provisions. But we're only, Atholl got it wrong. We're only 15 minutes by fast ferry. It's 20 minutes from the Isle of Wight to Southampton on a fast ferry, and we're halfway. So it'll be about 15 minutes in a fast ferry, and 15 to 20 minutes on the train when it reopens.
Okay, thank you. Can I bring in Alan Lipscomb, who had a question on car parking? Is Alan there? I'll ask his question for him. Atholl, I think this one is directed at you. What sort of parking ratios are you applying here, and how far would the major car parking area that you spoke about, how far will it be from all the different houses? Atholl?
On mute. In relation to the parking, we've put forward initial parking ratios based on two things. One is the standards that the local authorities wish us to keep to, but also taking into account the shared uses and a lower likely level of parking that is required. So we lower than the local authority current standards, but we've shown them with the numbers that we've been able to assess that it should be okay. To be honest with you, we expect probably in the longer term that there'll be less parking required, because as the environment changes, there's a lot more move towards shared car ownership and things. It takes time. It might take a decade before that feeds its way through, but we do expect eventually to have less car parking than we've currently suggested as a starting point. But the car parking numbers will follow with detailed planning applications. In relation to the location of parking, the parking is spread through the site, so probably no property would be more than 5 minutes walk from a car parking space. Some of the properties would be much closer because they'll be on top of the basement car park, and there'll be a lift access down to the car park. But it also means that really the incentive is to walk and cycle around the site, not to get in your car and drive 3 minutes to somewhere else, because it'll take you, a few minutes to go and get your car and get it out of the area. So it should be enough distance to be convenient, but not enough to make it too convenient. I guess that's the way I like to phrase it.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to bring in Tim Stoner, who has a point about cars. Tim, would you like to ask your very intriguing question? Oh, I've just had a message from Tim to say that he can only type. Let me read it out to you both, actually. Why do we seem to be so much against cars, especially electric cars, moving at slow speed? What would you prefer? A short stroll to an electric car at their doorstep, or a long walk to a deep basement car park? So there's a challenging question. There's more to the question, but I'm going to leave it at that point.
Well, I mean, maybe I can answer that. I think that part of the reason for having the parking as we've got it is that it's an efficient use of the existing infrastructure that's there. So there is this huge basement in a very central location, which is really being used partly for a new water canal and partly for parking. And that also gives you efficiencies in the way that you can allocate and use that parking while still providing pretty good access. Now, of course, I'm pretty sure that most people would rather have a car parked outside their front door. But of course, when you look at the densities that we need to create in this relatively small area of urban land, if you allowed on-plot car parking everywhere, in the manner described, you wouldn't be able to accommodate the densities. It would just become not really possible. I mean, our aspiration is that every car here is electric. That's for sure. And I think the proposal for electric charging points is effectively 100%, but not all of that will be put in at the first stage. So as Tim says, there's no problem in a car driving down a street, and electric cars are better than most in the air quality terms. But I think the particular nature of the site is that those streets will be far better with very low traffic on them. And there will be, the car park will be accessible.
Thanks, Atholl. Tim's secondary point about cars is that, cars through movement animates towns and provides economic irrigation. There is no through movement in a cul-de-sac. I think there is the impression from the presentation that this is a cul-de-sac. Is that the case? And will there be any through movement through this development?
Yes, I mean, so what maybe it didn't come out on the slide, but through the heart of the town is a new adopted road that runs between Calshot and the village and the beach and the activity centre, all the way up to Fawley and all the way up to the Southampton. So there's existing B road that is situated about 1 kilometre away from the site, and this new road will become the new road. So we certainly wish to encourage people travelling down the area to actually come to the development, and then to be able to access straight off that the basement car park that is situated there. Now, and so right in the heart of town, you have the ability to capture those people who wish to visit the site who are passing trades. There'll also be a little bit of surface car parking right by the dry boat marina stack, which you'll be able to stop at when you go there. In relation to the rest of the town, it's much more a sort of a walkable village, city or town than a car-driven one. I mean, I can think of many cities I've been to where you have the core of the centre, a very walkable, pleasant environment, and that is the current aim. I don't think that more cars in that environment would necessarily bring much more economic benefit, as opposed to the economic benefit you get from making a great environment.
Okay.
Those very walkable streets you could put seating outside, you could have cafes spilling out into the roads. It would be really, really quite a nice environment. I think there's a balance to be struck, and I think the balance is probably about right.
Thank you, Atholl. There is a question here from Benedict. It's about architecture. So, Benedict, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I was just interested in a lot of the visuals you show quite pastiche copies of 18th and 19th century architecture, and the views around the waterside look almost colonial, like straight out of a kind of 1850s USA. And I just wondered, seeing as it's a new town and everything's new, why you chose to look for that kind of inspiration in the buildings?
Okay, Aldred?
I happen to be a great fan of Charleston and Beaufort and other places in the American South, but so maybe some of that's come through. That has actually changed a bit. So those were some of the very early sketches that we did, and it's much more anchored in the vernacular of the national park now. And it was a strong steer from the planners that it needed to look of the national park, not something that some of our architect friends might like to have designed for it. But it's meant to blend very nicely into its landscape and feel of its place. And I think if you get the character right, then you can experiment a bit more with the architecture. And so it isn't necessarily one size fits all, but there will be some clear design guide rules that we will adopt to guide the architects. But I'm expecting to have quite a number of different architects on the project, and we'll see how they interpret those rules.
Okay, thank you, Aldred. We are running out of time a little bit, but there are still a number of questions. Philip Jackson, what is the population going to be, and will there be people working on site itself? I think this is a point that didn't come out as well, yeah. Aldred, if you can say about the employment and all the other uses.
There's in the first plan, there's about 1 million square feet of non-residential uses, and there's quite a significant area where that can grow, and that would accommodate about 2,500 jobs. I think we can actually have quite a few more than that over time, and so the idea is very much that there should be more jobs than households, and I think that the world is going to more work from home, not caused by but accelerated by this current crisis, and therefore I think we will have a very high working population on the site, and that will create vibrancy in the town at all times, and that really is critical for services to operate efficiently.
Okay. And then we have Jonathan Brooks, something about phasing and any early provisions. Jonathan, would you like to come in?
Yes, hello there. Really fascinating project. So thank you for your really good presentation. I suppose my thoughts were about the kind of early provision of uses on the site. I guess the thing about new places is around kind of habit forming. So if people have all of the facilities and services that they need kind of early on in a place, it allows those kind of habits to form early, which is a kind of a really important thing when you think about kind of sustainable movement patterns, transport provision, etc. So I suppose my first thought was, do you provide the railway as a piece of kind of upfront kind of enhanced infrastructure? And then is there a kind of interim provision for things like shops and other things that maybe couldn't be sustained until the kind of the wider population is established? Thank you.
It's absolutely critical that you provide enough services and enough activity quickly, and we're fortunate in so much as that you know, there is already strong demand from employers to locate here, particularly in sort of maritime and tech spheres, and so we're already talking to companies that want to build offices or build facilities. And we've got about 150 people working on site at the moment, so it's not, you know, it's not starting from scratch. MHI Vestas, the wind turbine manufacturer, will be there in the first couple of years, and that, you know, they employ, as I say, they employ just over 100 people, and there's about 50 people doing other things. So the critical thing, as we see it, is to foster that employment culture. Also, you know, we're not very far away from Exxon. Exxon's got 2,500 people working in it, of which quite a few live a fair distance from site. So one of the things we're talking to Exxon about is, you know, what are the sort of properties that their workforce would look for, and they also have the advantage of being very well paid. So you know, that's a very sensible discussion. You know, we're in an area of high housing demand, and we're also in an area of high demand for employment space. So it has a lot of good ingredients that make this type of project perhaps a bit easier here than it might be in some other locations.
Thank you, Aldred. We've run out of time. Plenty more questions to ask. I'm sorry I haven't managed to accommodate all your questions, but I hope you have found it an interesting and fascinating 1 hour. Thank you for giving up your lunch on our behalf. I hope you have enjoyed it. My thanks to the two presenters, Aldred Drummond and Atholl. My thanks also to the Academy, Stephen Gallagher, and my biggest thanks to the rest of you for joining us. I hope that you will find the time to join us for another Urbanism Hour, which I think is coming up in the next, in a week's time. But in the meantime, thank you, have a good afternoon and a good weekend.